and welcome to Dialogue. China and U.S. delegations have reached the basic consensus on arrangements to address key trade concerns after 2 days of talks in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The discussions touched on a wide range of issues, from tariffs and export controls to agriculture and digital trade, and both sides agreed to hammer out specific details through their domestic approval processes. So how do we make sense of this latest round of discussions? What calculations are driving each side? And could this signal a genuine step toward stabilizing the world's most consequential economic relationship? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Andy Mok, Senior Research Fellow at Center for China and Globalization, Anthony Chen, former JPMorgan Chase Chief Economist, and Dr. Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology. Welcome to Dialogue. Andy, I will start with you. So help us make sense of the latest round of discussion, and what kind of background, are we making progress? Anything substantial?
Well, Qingduo, I think first of all, while there's a lot of daily back and forth and a lot of, dust obscuring what's going on, but I think if we look a little bit deeper, this is inevitable that an agreement is reached. China has long maintained that there are structural complementarities between the Chinese and the U.S. economy, and therefore the relationship is largely balanced, not without friction. But actually it benefits both sides to work together, as we know, on a basis of mutual respect. And I think that that is sinking through, and that the real negotiation is actually not between the US and China, but it's actually happening inside the American mind, in that every tariff adjustment, export control, is really just a proxy for a deeper struggle, whether Washington can accept that the world is now co-authored and that China writes part of the rule book that once the U.S. dominated alone. And I think we can see this slowly seeping into the psyche of key American decision makers, including, of course, President Trump, Scott Bessent, others that are directly involved in this negotiation.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting observation, sort of beyond the trade itself, but about this global or bilateral, most important, arguably, relationship between the two in the world. And Anthony, if you look at the trade itself, when it comes to the details, yes, details remain to be out. Beijing says both sides have reached basic consensuses on way to address their respective trade concerns, while Washington describes the discussion as, moving toward an agreement. So we don't know the details yet, but how do we interpret these carefully worded statements from both sides?
Shindo, I think that the carefully worded statement made both by the United States and China is certainly to make sure that both sides do not have to make more concessions than they have to make to reach an agreement. I think it's pretty clear from what Andy said correctly that both countries are dependent on each other. Certainly in the United States, a lot of pressure from supporters of the president, namely farmers, who basically have a lot of products that they need to sell. There is pressure from consumers who are seeing higher prices because of tariffs. And there's certainly pressure from industry because they want to assure a steady stream of these metals that are necessary, not only for private sector, but also even for the government's objectives. So there is pressure on both sides, and I think that both sides want to make sure that they make the adequate number of concessions to reach a deal, but not more concessions than are necessary. And hence, that's the reason for the carefully worded words ahead of the meeting between the two heads of state.
Mm-hmm. Warwick, what's your observation? Do such statements, suggest a preliminary framework is taking shape?
Look, I'm sure that as the parties came together over the last couple of days, they were able to identify the issues that were on the table, and then progressively work their way through them. I mean, it's quite obvious to me that based on the reporting so far, that the United States is shelving its 100% tariff proposition, which was scheduled to come into effect on the 1st of November. Besant is framing that as a win based on Trump's leverage. But the reality is that tariffs was the centerpiece of Trump economics. Tariffs is actually the only solution, his favorite word, as they say, to solve America's deindustrialization problems. And if you're going to walk away from your centerpiece policy proposal in the face of some concrete realities about the way the world actually is changing, then I think it says something not so much about the Americans. I think it actually shows that they have an ability to progressively absorb reality, as Andy mentioned. But what it actually tells us is that the world has fundamentally changed. Imagine 10 years ago, or even 8 years ago, when the trade war was launched and when President Trump said trade wars are good and easy to win in March 2018. Imagine if at that time China proposed export licensing provisions for rare earth elements. It would never have happened. It wouldn't have flown. And today, of course, it is now part of the architecture. So what's happened now is really a reflection of the fact that the fundamental dynamics of global economic power have changed.
Fundamental dynamics of global power changing, let's say. Andy, of course, the talk itself touched upon a wide range of issues, like the export controls from both sides, actually. The U.S. Section 301 measures on China's vessels and the extension of the truth of tariffs, and also fentanyl-related tariffs and new law enforcement cooperation. On these issues, where do you see the progresses, or in a sense, it's concessions, right, made either by Beijing or Washington?
Well, Tingdo, I think that there's maybe two categories here. So when we look at things like soybeans and Boeing aircraft, clearly China has demand, enormous demand for both of these products. And then we look at the other category, things like rare earths. And I think one of the most important differences is that soybeans and civilian aircraft are fungible, in that if China does not buy them from the United States, it can get soybeans from Brazil, Argentina, maybe at a slightly higher price, but that's still available. And if it doesn't buy Boeing, of course, there's Airbus, and of course now China's own Comac as well. But when we look at rare earths, there really is, at least in the short term, no substitute. So I think, if we were to, in broad terms, outline what are the key issues, I think they're around this. Certainly, as Anthony said, farmers are a vital political constituency in the United States. They're in great pain right now. The midterms are coming up in the United States, the congressional elections. That I think every important stakeholder in the United States wants a deal. One group that Anthony did not mention is Wall Street. And Bill Ackman recently said that he really, really hopes that the U.S. and China can have a better relationship. Largely echoing the logic used by China. So I think it's not just Bill Ackman, but I think many investors on Wall Street also feel this way. So I'm a little bit more optimistic in that, again, as China says, there's friction that needs to be worked out, and it can be worked out. But the main thing is, can the U.S. successfully negotiate with itself to come to terms that this is a new world, as Warwick alluded to, that the U.S. is not only not in the driver's seat, but it also must adopt a certain sort of humility that equates in the past its dominance with also moral rightness. And this is, a difficult emotional barrier to overcome. But I think the good news is that we are seeing progress on this front.
Well, Anthony, progresses including soybean sales to export to the Chinese side. That's a likely result, one of the likely results, let's say. Many people assume that's, what's to happen. But then, of course, it's a give and take. So what's the U.S., agreed to some of the demands by the Chinese side, maybe?
Well, I think so. I mean, you've seen already a movement towards selling semiconductor chips that perhaps before they were more reluctant to sell. And as Andy pointed out, it's not just Bill Ackman, it's all of Wall Street. Every time that there is at least news out there that the Chinese and the United States are moving towards a deal, you see the futures markets exploding and going higher. But it's not just Wall Street, it's also the cryptocurrency market. You see Bitcoin, you see the alternate coins, all of them are going up because those are all risk on trades. And so if all of a sudden we're moving further away from a deal, then of course all the risk on trades, which includes Wall Street, which includes the talking heads of Wall Street, they're all going to become more pessimistic. And that, to some extent, influences consumer sentiment and business sentiment. So there are many, many factors out there that are sort of holding on to their hats, hoping that some sort of a deal takes place and fairly soon.
Well, Warwick, you earlier mentioned about rare earth. Like 2018, almost like 10 years ago, if China did that, things would be different. But this time around, what kind of role do you think the rare earth licensing control, let's say, has played during this negotiation with Washington?
Look, I think it's been a defining moment, actually. The announcement on the 9th of October led to an apoplectic reaction from Washington, in large part because it feared that a critical ingredient for the military-industrial complex was going to be squeezed without any alternatives for the best part of 10 years. Now, what this also showed, not only that the United States has a very significant, a very wide and deep soft underbelly, but that in fact China was willing to engage the United States toe-to-toe. And this was not something that you could contemplate even 8 years ago. And this is what I mean by the fundamental change in the structure of the balance of global power. Now, this doesn't mean that, that the United States is not a significant or an important country. Clearly it is, and it is not in anybody's interest for the United States to be impoverished. An impoverished America is one that behaves badly, both domestically and ultimately internationally. And I think China takes a very responsible attitude in relation to questions such as rare earths. It has a licensing regime, and it will have to work out how it will implement that. And no doubt it will engage with its stakeholders, including the United States, on all sorts of questions of administrative detail, such as whether or not there'll be whitelists for fast tracking. How is it that questions around dual-use technologies will be defined? Will there be exemptions? Will there be quantitative quotas for different kinds of uses? How is enforcement going to take place? What about auditing for compliance purposes? As Ronald Reagan once said, you can you can believe, but you've got to verify in the end. And if you're going to administer these sorts of mechanisms, you're going to need verification mechanisms as well. So there's a lot of detail to work out. And in the detail, there is, of course, a lot of room for all impacted parties to ensure that a balanced outcome is achieved.
Well, Besant said that this likely scenario is like the Chinese side will agree to delay the implementation of the rare earth control regime for 1 year. What does that mean? So do you expect like something will be up again a year later, or somehow this is the way forward? Both sides will see eye to eye. We don't want to fight over this anymore.
Well, kicking something down the road leaves open the issue to be tackled again in the future. The provisions are not going to go away. It is highly unlikely to impossible that China will remove these licensing requirements. The issue is going to be how they are implemented over time, and sorting out how best to implement these sorts of measures invariably takes time, and to do it well you need to engage with your counterparties, and that's what a window I think could possibly deliver to everybody concerned. But make no mistake, these new regimes are here to stay, and this evinces the reality that the balance of power globally has shifted in a way that levels the playing field, and the United States no longer enjoys unbridled primacy in the way that it has done for the past 35 years.
Well, Andy, on the tariffs, obviously there will be, let's say, extension of the truce over reciprocal tariffs for another certain period of time, which is expected to expire on November 10th. well, let's say it offers, like a temporary, a limited time period of relief, but that will provide probably more time for both sides to continue to engage with each other. Is that enough? And so there's no tariff reduction, can we say?
Well, Tingdo, I think that this is kind of maybe the most visible part of all of these moving parts, in that I think it's certainly in the interest of both sides to continue talking and reaching some sort of at least a short-term modus vivendi, hopefully a longer-term one as well. Again, I think China's view is the correct one, that there are structural complementarities between the Chinese and the U.S. economy, and it really makes sense for everyone, for both sides to work together. I want to add briefly to what Warwick said about the rare earth metals. I think what makes it a little bit tricky, though, is that some of these, of course, are used for fighter jets, guided missiles, things like this. And part of the challenge for China then is, logically, do you want to be supplying key military components to a country that has occasionally, at least, threatened you militarily? So I think that this, again, will require perhaps a rethink and a recalibration by the United States if it does want to maintain a certain technological level in its military capabilities, and that it does rely on China for some of those components. Certainly, that's a circle that needs to be squared. I think that makes it a little bit tricky, but we have to see.
Anthony, do you think, of course, one of the disputes is over the fees, extra fees on the vessels from the Chinese side, 301 investigation. Do you think there's any progress? Because obviously China also taken countermeasures against the U.S. ships, or certain percentage of U.S. ownership, that kind of vessels. So some say, probably this is easy for both sides to be back, from imposing tariffs on each other. Is that the case?
Well, Shindor, what's going on? Nothing is simple, as Dr. Warwick mentioned with the rare earth metals. While they're pushing it out 1 year, and the reason for that is to maintain leverage. If you say I eliminate them, then you lose that leverage proposition. With regard to the vessels, you really need to understand that the investigation has basically said that China puts U.S. vessels at an economic disadvantage, and that's why they put the port fees on, and they also put tariffs on products that are used in the United States related to those shipping vessels. So again, it's a fight for both countries to maintain the power, but in a compromise or in a negotiation, both sides have to give in. So I think that goes back to some of the questions that you've raised before, Chindor, that in a negotiation, both sides have to give in and make concessions. And so there are going to be concessions that the United States doesn't want to make, and there are concessions that China doesn't want to make. But if you're going to get or reach or attain some sort of a deal, both countries will have to basically hold their breath a little bit and make those concessions. And with regard to the results and the outcome of the Section 301, there's no question that if we impose these tariffs and fees, port landing fees, that the United States vessels gain an advantage, but the Chinese can do the same thing. So again, to reach an agreement, both sides have to step back and acknowledge that concessions have to be made. And guess what? They will be made, because a deal between both countries is in the best interest of both countries. So yes, those deals will be made and concessions will be made.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anthony, earlier we mentioned about the soybeans. I mean, soybeans probably is more than like an export issue or trade issue with the Chinese side. It is also, let's say, political, given the upcoming midterm election. The president, obviously, President Trump doesn't want to, lose the support of the farmers, right? So that's, say, more urgent for Washington?
I think it is urgent. I did a keynote presentation for a group of farmers about a year ago, and they basically were very, very supportive. And I did one just 2 months ago. And now many of the farmers are saying that they're on the verge of filing for bankruptcy. These are farmers that have had these farms for multiple generations, some 4, some 5 generations, and now they're in danger of losing those farms. So it's not just a negotiation situation. It's a desperation plea by these farmers that were once supporters. And now, ironically, many of these supporters are turning against the White House. And again, if this continues to spread, not only is it a bad thing for the midterm elections, but it's also a bad thing from a long-term perspective, because this has been a key constituency for the Republican Party. And that's why they're talking about not only making sure that this is front and center, but guess what? The Chinese know this very, very well. These grain elevators are filled to the hilt, and these farmers are basically on the edge of bankruptcy. So given these this desperation situation, it is an opportunity for China, but it's also a necessity for Washington to reach and make concessions to make this problem go away.
Warwick, right now, so both countries, they will go through a domestic approval process. I understand that's approval by the two leaders. So how likely is it for the two leaders, whether they will be able to, given, in a short period of time, right, they were given, will be able to finalize these issues? And do you expect any substantial, tangible progress that will be, written on a written agreement between the two sides when the two leaders meet very soon?
Well, if there is going to be one, the teams drafting these agreements are going to be working around the clock, because we're looking at about 3 days to pull something together. Let's not forget that the terminology that's been used by both sides indicates that what we're talking about is really frameworks and something edging towards an agreement. And it wouldn't surprise me if, in fact, that's where we end up, is that we end up with some progress in terms of how issues are to be dealt with and what the expected parameters are, but those will still need to be hammered out by the different administrative teams who obviously work for the leaders. It's going to be difficult to pull off a proper, thorough agreement in 3 days, but people who are committed and can work hard, good luck to them, I say.
Right. Andy, I think you mentioned, a couple of times this complementary nature of the two economies. At the Chinese side often repeats the two economies by working together, both benefits from this kind of cooperation. But I think there's also a challenge, that is, what does the U.S. want by imposing tariffs, for example, and also extra fees on the Chinese vessels? They talk about, they face a situation of deindustrialization. They want to, let's say, regain industrialization by imposing extra fees, imposing tariffs, or even for some politicians to contain the rise of China. But if that does not change, can we say, can we engage in, say, good faith negotiation, as long as there's, agreement, mutually agreed, and we know that it will benefit both sides? Can we, ultimately, can we achieve an agreement out of that kind of intention?
Well, Chengdu, I think that really cuts to the crux of the issue here when we think about domestic approval processes. Because first of all, some would describe the U.S. as agreement incapable. Because if there's a change in president, we can see 180-degree policy pivots. We can see gridlock because the executive branch wants to do one thing, the legislative branch wants to do another. So when I hear this term, domestic approval processes, what I start thinking about is how can any country, China or any other country, really have faith that there is a durable, dependable agreement. And of course, we can prove that, first of all, that the executive branch can decide to do something. And I think here, with President Trump and President Xi meeting on Thursday, certainly a deal can be reached, as Warwick said, a framework deal. But in terms of actually making it durable, I think we have to see, can it get through the U.S., not just as an executive order, but ideally we want to see it in law. And with the House of Representatives not in session and the government shutdown, there's all kinds of questions about that. And then we also have to think about, ideally, at the state level as well. I mean, we would want, a national agreement that applies, from the East Coast to the West Coast to the Midwest. And is that possible? So I think these are kind of the questions that I think of when I think about a durable agreement. But I want to briefly say that Trump is not just about tariffs. I mean, he also talks about the importance of reforming the state. And I won't go into that here, but a burdensome tax regime, stifling regulations that are not directly related to China, but certainly I think if these are addressed, it certainly makes the U.S. A better partner for China and other countries in many important respects. So tariffs are obviously central to Trump's approach, but I think he also wants to do some other pretty big things as well.
Well, Anthony, earlier you also mentioned about this like a sort of a gradual sense or talk about a mutually beneficial engagement in terms of trade between the two sides. Do you think that will become a force that deserve to be recognized and that will somehow impact the decision making in terms of this bilateral relationship, rather than pursuing a decoupling policy, or some say would say isolationist policy?
There's no question that trade is mutually beneficial to both countries, and that's why this administration has devoted so much energy to trying to get some sort of a deal. And I hear Dr. Warwick, I hear Andy talking about whether these deals can be longer term. But the reality is this is a mercurial administration, and things change very rapidly. Just days ago, we were very, very close to the United States to making a deal with Canada. Then all of a sudden, you got one commercial and the deal breaks down. So
right.
I think the Chinese are looking at all this and realize any type of deal doesn't have longevity as one of its real factors. But again, over the near term, to basically make sure that trade continues, because 100% tariff essentially says no more trade between China and the United States. You cannot have trade with 100 or 150% tariffs. It just doesn't happen. And that's not going to benefit both countries. Both countries need to make sure that does not happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, Warwick, earlier we talked about these shifting powers between the two countries. And obviously we are seeing increasingly like the balanced or equal sort of economic power between the two countries. But somehow they are, struggling to figure out what's the way to engage with each other, exactly because they are, more of an equal power. So that probably will take some time probably for them to find out a way to coexist peacefully.
Look, no doubt the United States has got some mental adjustments to make in terms of its place in the world. It has benefited from over 30 years of being the dominant unipolar actor, and that world is no longer there. Unipolarity arguably ended 6, 7, 8 years ago, but it's taking time for the consequence of the end of unipolarity to work its way through both the sort of economic structures which are driving a lot of these issues, but ultimately also influence the political calculus and the political culture that dominates Washington, D.C. and those who operate inside the Beltway. This is going to be a bitter pill to swallow because this is the end of Pax Americana, and nobody inside the Beltway wants to be responsible for that.
On that note, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinzhuo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.